Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me here for this initial assessment of the 2021 Australian Government budget that was brought down by Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, last night. That's almost 6 months after the usual date of the budget in the second week of May, and unlike previous budgets in recent years, I wasn't able to be part of the Australian Broadcasting Commission's squad within the budget lockup, which would have given me access to the budget papers at about 1:30 in the afternoon, and then able to emerge at 7:30 having read all of them. It was a bit like the old days when, along with the general public, I couldn't get access to the budget papers until 7:30, and you'd be up till after midnight pouring through them, which is what I was last night. But anyway, as a result, we now have a presentation which I'm pleased to be able to share with you. So let me begin this assessment of last night's federal budget with a view on the economy. Sometimes I put the view on the economy after the details of the budget, but clearly, this one is shaped by the dramatic change in Australia's economic performance and outlook since the pandemic began in the middle of March. And it's therefore, I think, helpful in understanding what the budget is seeking to do and why it looks the way it does to set the economic scene first. And as I think people participating today will be well aware, Australia's now in its first recession for almost 30 years, and its worst recession, at least measured by the contraction in real GDP, if not by the increase in employment, its worst recession since the Great Depression of the early 1930s. Treasury, in the budget papers issued last night, is forecasting a reasonably strong turnaround in economic activity, as you can see here. I've got my doubts that economic growth can rebound quite as quickly as the Treasury is forecasting there. So for that reason, I suspect their forecasts may be a little on the optimistic side. This next chart provides a little bit more detail of the Treasury's GDP forecasts. In particular, you can see that the strong recovery which the government's forecasting for the 21-22 financial year is very much driven by an expectation of a strong rebound in household consumption of almost 6% in 2021-22, and a strong rebound in dwelling investment after two very significant years of decline. One other striking forecast in the budget documents that I think does have some potentially serious economic consequences is the substantial downward revisions to the forecasts of population growth. Against that background, then, let me turn to look at the budget itself. And what's striking, of course, as everyone knows, is how dramatically the government's budget position has changed since the onset of the pandemic. What wasn't in the budget, by contrast with what is? Well, there was no suggestion of any extension to the JobKeeper scheme beyond the currently scheduled expiry date of the 31st of March. That, of course, doesn't preclude the possibility that the government could extend it again if, for example, Victoria or some other state had another outbreak like Victoria has just had, or if for some other reason the unemployment rate were to be much higher in the early part of next year than the budget assumes. Despite those seemingly mind-boggling or eye-watering numbers with regard to deficits and debt, the government's certainly not having any difficulty raising the money it needs. So what's my overall assessment of the budget after all of that? Well, the best word I could come up with was appropriate for the circumstances. I was tempted to say that this was the budget that Australia had to have, echoing Paul Keating's memorable comment about the recession we supposedly had to have in the early 1990s. And that's probably not a bad moniker either. But it's a budget that, in its broad dimensions, is an appropriate response to the circumstances in which the government and in which all Australians have now found ourselves. But it is one that's heavily reliant on individuals and businesses responding positively to the incentives which it contains. What could go wrong? What could bring about those worse than expected scenarios? Well, obviously, as any Victorian could tell you, if there were to be another wave of infections requiring another comprehensive lockdown, even if it were only in one state, that would undermine the forecast economic recovery and require additional fiscal responses from the government. Ladies and gentlemen, is my take on last night's federal budget. Thank you very much for listening to all of that.